And welcome to the official start of CS40 today. We are about a third of the way through the semester. I hope your midterms and all of your other classes are going smoothly and you're all doing excellent in all those classes. Let's see, so today I have a couple of administrative stuff for us to go over, and then we'll talk about some new material. So admin wise, let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And so I have pulled up right now the course survey that you all just took. So thank you for filling it out, those of you who did. And so one of the first things you see is that most people feel more stressed out than normal this semester, which I think is to be expected given the weirdness of this semester. And so I'm going to try to make some adjustments to the course to reduce the workload a little bit and hopefully reduce your stress level, at least related to this course. And I'll talk about those in a minute. Looks like most people find that CS40 is about the same amount of work as other classes, with a few people finding it a bit more. This is a pretty typical breakdown of whether we're online or in person. I get this same sort of results. And I think this is just because for a lot of people, programming is totally new and it is just a different, harder way of thinking. So this is something that I expected. Similarly and related, so a lot of people say that the Python assignments are too hard, about half the class saying too hard and half saying it's the right difficulty. And I think this is probably related to being online a little bit, that when we're in person and you're working on the labs, it's really easy to like talk to your neighbors and collaborate with them. I think that makes the difficulty of the assignments a lot less, because maybe you're struggling on one idea, but your neighbor has that insight that can help. So I have some ideas too on how to change things up for this. Yeah, in particular, so there was a lot of good written comments at the bottom, and a lot of the comments were about how wanting the lectures to tie more directly into the lab work. And so going forward, I'll try to make those connections a little bit more explicit between the lecture and the lab work. In terms of speed of lecture, it seems like most people find that about right, and most people seem to like the pre-lecture videos, so I'm glad about that. And most people who have met with the tutors are finding that helpful. So I'm glad about that. If you do have any other feedback that you'd like to give me, feel free to shoot me an email, but no obligation about that. Any questions about the survey so far? Okay. So the quick update on well, let's see. So all assignments are graded at this point. I've finished grading everything up to date in grades. I think there's about 10 to 15 missing assignments or labs or missing quizzes between various people in the class. And since this is a weird semester, it's really easy to forget about something and accidentally not turn it in. And so I'm going to have a grace period until Wednesday of this week, that if you have a 0 in anything, or your grade is just not what you want it to be in anything, you have until Wednesday of this week to resubmit it, and I will regrade it with 0 late penalty. Any questions about that policy? So I recommend that sometime today after class, just log onto Sakai, make sure that your grade is what you think it is, that you've submitted everything that you think you have. And if not, you have 2 days to get that corrected. The next thing is the quiz for this week. Actually, let's talk about the quiz first. So the quiz this week is the format's still, instructions still exactly the same, but I want to talk about it a bit because there's sort of a new part to each question. And in addition to having some code where you're going to write out what the output of the code is, there's this sort of multiple choice part up top where you have to either say whether the code has an error message in it, or whether it does not have an error message and it runs successfully, or whether it runs forever. And so the second part of the question, like actually what is the output, that only applies if there is no error message. But if there is an error message, then all you have to circle is generate an error, or if it runs forever, all you have to circle is runs forever, and you don't have to write out any output. Are there any questions about that? Okay. In general, people have been doing pretty well on the quizzes. And one of the things you might notice about these quizzes is that they're a lot more abstract than the lab problems. They're really just designed to make sure that you can think through, sort of manually evaluate in your head or in pencil and paper what Python's going to do, rather than solving a large piece of programming puzzle. Because in the real world, when you're solving those large programming puzzles, you have Google and all these other, you have Python available, typing in Python, seeing what works, what doesn't work. And these are sort of more like lifting weights, just exercising these particular muscles that will make you better at those larger problems. If you do have questions, or I also wanted to remind you that you're encouraged to work with each other on these quizzes, or to take them to the course tutors to work on it with them. Then let's see, the next thing is I'll talk about the lab for this week. So there are 2 labs this week, and we'll talk about the labs in detail on Thursday when it's the actual lab day. But I just wanted to give you a heads up that so part 1 is going to be worth 10 points like normal, and this is going to be really directly connected to the lecture component, the things that we're going to talk about in lecture this week. And part 2 is sort of an optional lab. It'll only be worth 3 points. So if you choose not to complete it, then it's not going to have a significant impact in your grade, and I will not personally be offended if you choose to not complete it. But this part will be more of a stretch part of the lab that does not directly correlate to the things that we're talking about in lecture today. So if you're in that position where you feel like you wanted more connection between the lab and the lecture, then you can just do this part, and your grade will be fine for it.
Is it like an extra credit thing, like part 2?
So if you choose not to do part 2, you will get a 0 out of 3. So it is not extra credit, it's normal credit, but it's a small amount of normal credit. And there is actually some extra credit in part 1. So if you choose to do that extra credit, then you can make up these points that way and choose not to do this part. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Any other questions on any of the administrative stuff that I just went over?
Yeah, I don't think I can resubmit one of the quizzes. It doesn't give me the option to resubmit it.
Okay, if you're unable to resubmit on Sakai for whatever reason, just shoot me an email with the submission stuff, and I'll put it in manually.
Okay.
That's a good question. Any other questions about anything administrative? Okay, I want to give us next a real quick look at what we're going to be doing over about the next month of the course in Python. And so I'm going to scroll down on our course's README file which is again written in Markdown and then rendered into HTML using one of these Markdown to HTML compilers. And so here we are today. We're going to be looking at something called JSON in Python, and then later this week we'll be looking at something called matplotlib, and we'll be combining both of these two things to do our first real data analysis using Python. And in particular, we're going to be looking at Trump's tweets. That's your lab for this week, and calculating some statistics on about what Trump says on Twitter, like how often does he mention the Mexico wall versus healthcare versus Obama versus whatever else you are interested in that. And then what I'm really excited for is what we're going to be going over sort of the following 2 weeks after that, is we're going to be using libraries to access Reddit, the social media website. And you're going to be generating your own propaganda bots that will be spreading propaganda about candidates of your choice in the upcoming US elections. And we'll talk about the details of that over those 2 weeks. But the sort of key unifying theme of these next 3 weeks is that we're not going to be talking about Python details anymore. We're going to be talking about Python libraries and how to use these libraries that other people have written to make your code do really complicated things in a really easy fashion. And so if we go on to our week 5 and look at the comic for this week, it's showing programming expectations of here's this programmer and he's typing in tons and tons and tons of stuff. But in reality, what programmers do is we just say import library, and the library is going to do all the complicated stuff for us. So when we're doing this Twitter analysis, well, there's a library called JSON and a library called matplotlib, which does 99% of the work for us. And then when you're writing these bots that will run on Reddit, there's a library that does, again, 99% of that work for us. So let's go right into how to actually do that now, how to interact with these libraries. Oops. And so I'm going to start off today like normal. We have our monday.py file up here, which is where we will be typing our code. And then I have my terminal open down here. And I also have this monday.json file open over here. And so I call it a JSON file because it ends in .json, pronounced JSON. And JSON files are a common way for people to transfer information in Python or in really any programming language. And in particular, this is the format that Twitter uses to store all of their tweets and to distribute tweets to people who are analyzing them. And if you look at this JSON file, you can see that it looks very similar to some Python syntax that we've already seen. That we have this square bracket, which indicates a list. And so here we have 2 dictionaries inside of this list. And each one of these dictionaries corresponds to a tweet. And it has various information about them. So there's the text of this tweet. Here's the day that the tweet was sent, how many retweets it has, how many people have favorited the tweet. And then this right here, this Boolean variable is retweet, indicates whether it's an original tweet or it's retweeting somebody else. And so here's just 2 tweets, both of them actually sent by Trump. Trump at this point has sent about 53,000 tweets from his account. And so in this week's lab, you'll be analyzing all of those 53,000 tweets. Yeah, so with these 2 tweets, whatever analysis we're going to do, you could easily just do that by hand looking at them. But with 53,000, that's getting to the point where you probably don't want to manually read through all of those tweets, and it makes sense to write a Python program to do it for us. Yeah, so this is the An example of a JSON file ending in .json is how you know it's JSON, and then the syntax inside, essentially the same exact thing as Python syntax for lists and dictionaries. Any questions so far? Okay, then in our Python file over here, I'm going to go over again how we load data from files, and then I'll go over how to actually do what we call parsing the JSON object. So whenever we are loading from a file, the sort of format, the pattern that we use is there's this with keyword, then open, then the name of the file. I named the file monday.json, and notice that, so over here on the left, I have the whole folder open that I'm working with. And so here's my monday.py file, and the monday.json file is also contained in the same folder. So it's important that whatever file you're opening is in the same folder as where you're working. And then I want to read information from this file. So I'm going to put an R right here. It would also be possible to put a W here if I wanted to write to the file, but I just want to read from the file. So I'll have an R as the second parameter. And then we'll say as F like this. And now anywhere within this code block, remember anything after the colon is called a code block if it's indented to the right. Anywhere inside this code block, I'll have access to this variable f, which contains the information about the file. If I want to get the actual text inside of the file, the pattern is f.read. F.read actually steps through and reads the entire contents of the file into memory and puts it into this variable text. So it's a little bit confusing that working with files is a two-step process. First, you open the file, and then you read the contents of the file like this. Now, this variable text, I can access it with inside of the code block like this. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Run that. And down here, you can see it printed out the contents of my monday.json file, same as this over here. But this text variable exists both within this code block and outside of this code block. So if I run this again like this, it still works and there's no error message. So this text, again, this variable exists both within this code block and anywhere below this code block. And so it'll be common for you to see people put all of their code related to files inside of the code block like this, but you'll also see it common to just have a single line code block opening the file and then using the text variable down below like this. One of the common error messages you'll get, you may have already seen this when working on your homework assignment, is that if your file name does not exist, and we run this, then we'll get this helpfully named file not found error message. And it'll tell us that monday.jso is not found. And the reason for that could be because either you have a typo in the name of your string, or you don't have this file currently located in the same folder as your Python program. So any questions about the file opening up here?
Yeah, Mike, I have a question. So why would, could you talk a little bit more about the difference between using R and W and like why sometimes you would only want to read and why sometimes you would like want to write?
Sure, that's a great question. At this point, we're just going to only be considering our reading from these files. We'll see more examples of writing to the files later. But at this point, just know that R is what you want to have here for reading from JSON files. Yeah, that's not a super satisfying answer probably, but that's the the best answer for now. Good question. Any other questions so far?
Mike, for the as f on the first line,
Mhm.
is the f arbitrary because it looks like it could be changed, but is that a requirement?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this f is any variable name can be used right here. So it's common for if you're only working with like a single file at a time, for this just to be called f, standing for file. But it could be called like input file, and then down here this would just be input file as well. So any variable name can be put here or here. That's a great question. Any other questions about loading from the file? Okay, so so now we have this whole big file loaded into a string inside of Python, but we would probably like to, for example, get this 28, this retweet count as a number, something that I can actually just access. But at this point, we can't access it directly. We just have this, because we just have this giant string. And so there's a couple things that we can do about that. One is that maybe using techniques that we've seen before, we could try doing a slice of text to figure out like what is this, the location for this 2 character and what is the location for this 8 character, and try to predict what they are, something like 100 to 102, and maybe that would extract the 28. But you can see that this technique would not, it's not very robust, because if, say, this tweet contained a different number of words in it, then the position in the string of this 28 would be different, and so I would have to adjust these locations. And similarly, that's only going to get me, even if I found the right locations here, that would only get me this 28, and it would not get me this value down here for this retweet count. And so somehow what I need to do is a more elegant way of converting this string into an actual Python value. And that's where the JSON library comes into play. So JSON is a library that's built into Python, and you can just say import JSON on any computer. You don't have to install anything, and you'll have access to it. And then there's this function, json.loads. This S in loads stands for string. So in my head, I usually say loads just because it's easier to say, but then I know what I'm really saying is load string. And whatever string value gets put in here is going to get, we say it's parsed by the JSON module. And what parsing means is it converts a string into an actual Python object. So if I were to put text right here, say tweets equals json.loadString of text. Now this tweets variable is going to be the, just like if I copied and pasted this into Python, it'll be a list with 2 dictionaries inside of it. And so I could say something like tweets of 0 to get the first tweet here. And then I can put in retweet count right here to get this actual number 28. And so let's say retweets equals, just check to see if this works. And I'll comment out that so it doesn't get in the way. Run that, and retweets equals 28, giving me this 28 right here. And so if instead of wanting this first tweet, I wanted this second tweet, I would change this 0 to a 1 to now get this tweet down here. And if I rerun that, then I get the 33 instead of the 28. Are there any questions so far?
I have
Juan, go ahead first.
okay. So I cannot see the difference between text text open bracket, zero close bracket, open bracket, retweet count close bracket.
Your question is, if we did something
What's
like this, what would happen?
retweet count is a key name of the dictionary. So yeah, what's the difference between that statement with the twist?
Great question. So let's try it out. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll see that we get an error message down here that says type error, string indices must be integers. And so let's look into detail about what's happening when we do this. So text, anytime you call this read function, what you get out is a string. And so text is going to be a string. And anytime when we index a string, we get the character at this position. So when I say text of 0, what that's going to give me is the very first character in the string, just this square bracket. And so to demonstrate that,
so it is a string, not a list.
exactly.
Oh,
Text is just a
okay.
string and nothing special.
Okay.
And so yeah, when we do text at 0, we just get this square bracket. Yeah, so anytime you use this read function, you just get text as the output, and then you have to somehow convert that text into the Python object that you need. So that's a great question. Any other questions so far?
Okay, so if we want to get like the retweet counts for both tweets at the same time, do we just leave the first bracket empty and it will give us like both of the retweet counts?
This is a great question. So here I'm just getting the retweet counts for an individual tweet at a time. But what if we want to, say, process multiple tweets at once? And the way we do that, anytime you want to, let's see, so remember that tweets is a list. And so anytime we want to process every item in a list, we have to use a for loop over that list. So I'll say for tweet in tweets, print retweet count equals, and then tweet of retweet count like this. And I'll comment out this one. And so remember, tweets is a list. It is this list right here. So every item in tweets, is a dictionary representing an individual tweet. So that's why I called this an individual tweet. And then that is a dictionary. And so by subscripting by retweet count, I'm looking up the retweet count of this individual tweet. So let's rerun this. And now it prints out the both of these retweet counts, 28 and 33.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Let's see, so some common patterns for me to highlight here is that anytime I have a variable that is plural ending in S, that indicates to me that that is a list of some sort. And so that's not a requirement in Python, but that's just a habit that I'm in to make my own life easier, that if I see something that's plural, I know that it's a list. And then anytime I have a for loop, I have the variable inside of here being the same name as the variable outside here, just not plural. And that way I know that it's an individual item inside of this list. And that just helps me keep track of things. So this is a common pattern that you'll have to do in your labs, and your next homework assignment is that you'll be loading up these tweets like this, and you'll have to loop through them, processing each individual tweet at a time. And so having a for loop like this is the pattern that you'll want to have. If instead of getting the retweet count, there was something else, say I wanted the date that it was created at, we can just change that right here to be created at. And now we get all the different dates that the tweets were created at. They're not guaranteed to be listed in any particular order, except that they will be in whatever order they were listed in the original file. If the original file has them listed in created at time order, then they'll be listed in that order down here, but that's not guaranteed. All great questions. Any other questions so far? Okay. So I want to take a look at what some of the error messages that happen when you're using these JSON library and see what kind of error messages we might get. So the first is, let's see what happens if I forget to put a comma at the end of one of my dictionary items. So there should be a comma right here, but I'm going to forget to have a comma. And VS Code helpfully underlines this, saying that it's an error. But let's see what Python says. So I'm going to save this, come back to Python, and press the triangle button. And notice that if I'm on a JSON file, there is no triangle button in the top right corner. So in order to get the triangle button, you have to be back into your Python file. So now press the triangle button, and we get this error message. Anytime you see something that says JSON decode error as your error message, that means that somehow the syntax of your JSON file is the problem. The problem is not with Python, even though it's Python generating the error. If you see JSON decode error, that means that actual error is contained within your JSON file. And so that's one thing that's confusing about this error message. The second thing that's confusing is all of the different line numbers that are appearing in this error message. So we see line 6, line 7, line 319. I don't have any files that say 319, have 319 lines. And so we have to figure out where do all these line numbers sort of come into play. And with this, the very last line number, so the one that's on the same line as the JSON decode error, this line 6 corresponds to line 6 in your JSON file. And so here, line 6 is where the error message is happening, but it's actually line 5 just beforehand where I needed to add the comma. So whenever you have an error message, always look at both the line the error message is on and the line above to check the syntax. These other lines, so these 3 lines right here, you notice that Python always puts the name of the file before it puts the line number that the error message happens on. So these 3 lines are the location in the JSON library that the error message happens in. So they're not important for us. But this line up here is inside one of our files, monday.py, so that one is important to us. That's line 7. So if I come back over to monday.py and look at line 7, that's the line where I'm actually calling the load_s function. Sometimes you'll be loading multiple JSON files in your program. And so in order to tell which JSON file has the error message, you'll have to first look through the Python errors to find the appropriate line in the Python that's causing the problem. So line 7. So the error is contained in the text variable. The text variable was loaded from monday.json. And so now when I look at the JSON decode error, it's in line 6, and I know to go to monday.json and find line 6. Are there any questions about that? What any of these error messages or line numbers so far mean? Okay. So this would be an error message both in Python and in JSON. but JSON, it turns out, is in some ways a lot more flexible than Python. So Python is very picky about white space. JSON doesn't care about white space at all. JSON's more like HTML that way. So here, this would not be valid Python, but it is valid JSON. And so if I save this, Control S, come back to Monday, rerun it, and no error messages. So Python cares about white space, JSON does not care about white space. Another thing that's similar between both Python and JSON is that the order of items in a dictionary does not matter. So if I were to say, delete all of those, come down here, put them down here, comma here, delete this comma, that's the same exact value from a JSON perspective, that the order of dictionary things doesn't matter. So if we save that, come over here, rerun it, we'll still get the same exact results. So order inside of a dictionary doesn't matter, but order inside of a list does matter. So if I take this one and copy and paste it up here, add this comma. So now the Thursday, December 3rd comes first. And if we rerun this, we'll see, oops, I have to save the file as well. So yeah, when you press the triangle button, it only saves your Python file, does not save your JSON file. So now when I press the triangle button, the Thursday, December 3rd comes before Wednesday, December 23rd, because this tweet up here comes before this tweet inside of the list. So the takeaway is order matters for the square brackets, order does not matter for the curly braces. Another difference between Python and JSON is that in JSON, true and false values have lowercase, false and true, whereas in Python, true and false values have uppercase, false and true. So this will give me an error message, JSON decode error, and now this is sort of ambiguous or difficult to tell what's going on, expecting value, line 8, column 23. But if we go over here, line 8, column 23, that'll be exactly where we need to fix it, and that should be lowercase. Another difference between Python and JSON is that in Python, single quotation marks and double quotation marks are both allowed. In JSON, only double quotation marks are allowed. Any questions about any of those differences between Python and JSON? Okay. Then the next thing for us to go over, there's one last difference between Python and JSON that I want to go over, and that is that in Python, you're allowed to have commas at the end of dictionaries like this, and you're allowed to have commas at the end of lists like this. But in JSON, that will give us an error. Okay, the next thing to go over with this Python and JSON is that JSON does not have to be included in a separate file like this. And it's possible to include JSON directly into, say, Python code by doing something like this. Well, let's see. Up here, I loaded text from this file, but I could have instead said text equals, and then copy and paste this file into this string right here. So here I've loaded the text variable from this file. Here I just have this text variable contained within a string. And both of these will work perfectly fine for Python. It doesn't care where the text comes from. Python doesn't care where this text variable comes from. It just cares that somehow some text got inserted into here. And so when we start talking about Reddit, this will come up because Reddit, they actually store everything as JSON as well, but we'll be having to make requests to web pages to get the JSON. And the key thing to sort of know is that once you have something in a string, it doesn't matter where it came from. You can just treat it just like any other string. And in particular, you can just pass it to this json.loads function to get that tweet object out. Any questions about this so far? Okay. Then I want to do some examples of processing the text out of these tweets. And let's go ahead and we'll be printing the text instead of printing the dates. And so here's the text of these two tweets. And what I want to do is check whether there's certain words contained in this text or not contained in this text. And again, this is just a string variable just like any other. And so we can use all of our string operations on it, just like we would any other string. And so one of those string operations that, that we saw was the in operator. And in particular, we could do something like if Donald in tweet text print mentions Donald. And now if I rerun that, then this if statement will be false for the first, false for this first tweet right here because it does not mention the word Donald, but it'll be true for this second tweet right here because it does mention the word Donald. And a really common pattern when using these checking if one string is in another string is to first convert the target string, the string that we're doing the check in, into lowercase, and then do our check only in a lowercase version of the string. And that way, whether it is like Donald like this, or Donald, or any other weird capitalization, it'll still be able to figure out that the tweet mentions Donald, even though it's all in uppercase, because I'm first converting it to lowercase, and then doing the check. Any questions about that? Okay. In your assignment, what you're, or in the lab for this week, what the lab is essentially asking you to do is to come up with a list of keywords like this, and loop through a bunch of files, checking to see how many tweets contain each of these keywords. So in order to track how many tweets or how many keywords have appeared, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. One is to just create a variable for each of the keywords. So num Donalds, and it'll start off at 0. And then inside of my if statement down here, we would say num Donalds plus equals to 1, and then print num Donalds equals num Donalds. And rerun that, and we get that the num Donalds is equal to 1 because this first tweet does not contain Donald, but this second tweet does contain Donald. And then if we wanted to check for a different word, say like Trump, we could do num Trumps starting off as 0, and then we can have another if statement, num, or if Trump in tweet text lower, num Trumps plus equals to 1, come down here, printing num trumps equals num trumps. And run that. And we get 1 and a 2. Both of these tweets mention Trump, so that's why there are 2 Trumps and only 1 Donald. And we could continue this pattern for however many keywords that we want to do this check for. But if there were, say, like 1,000 keywords that we wanted to check, this would be a really awkward pattern to just keep copying and pasting over and over again. It would be very unhacker-like. So a slightly more elegant solution is to let's create a list of all the terms that we want to check. So let's create Donald and Trump. And then let's create a dictionary, which I'll call term counts. It'll be a dictionary. And what I'll want to do is have each key in this dictionary correspond to one of these terms, and each value correspond to how many times that term has actually appeared. So I'll do for term in terms, term counts of terms equals to 0. So at the very beginning, we want everything to just start off as having 0 counts. And then down here, we'll, instead of having manually writing these if statements, one for each term, I'll have another for loop for term in terms. And we'll do if term in tweet of text dot lower, then term counts of term plus equals to 1. So the contents of this if statement are the same as the contents of both of these if statements. I've just replaced this, we would call these string literals. Anytime you have a value that's just directly input into Python, those are called literal values. So these are string literals. These would be integer literals. I've replaced those literals with this variable term, which is taken from my terms list. And then down here, we have the same pattern of printing multiple times. So let's add a for loop for term in terms, print term, let's do num, comma, term, comma, equals, comma, terms of, term counts of term. And now if I run that, we get these first 2 num underscore Donalds, num underscore Trumps come from these 2 print statements right here. Then this for loop generates, scroll that back down. This for loop generates these 2 print statements right here. And now it's really easy for me to add new terms that I want to search over. I can add, say, Obama right here, and let's add Syria and run that. And we can see that both Obama and Syria are not mentioned at all in either of these 2 tweets. But if we were searching over many other tweets, then they would be mentioned. Are there any questions about this pattern of using a dictionary to store counts instead of individual variables, and then replacing all of these individual sections with for loops over the keys of the dictionary? Okay. Then for, there's one last bit for me to talk about today, and that is in relation to the actual lab, how to get the data that you're going to be working with. So I'm going to come over to, back to the webpage, and the instructions with the links to the data are contained in this lab part1.py file. So I'll come over here, lab_part1.py, and then the detailed instructions of exactly how to fill out the lab are down here. But this link right here contains the link to the actual Twitter archive that contains Trump's tweets. And you can see that it's stored on GitHub as well. It's very common for data sets to be stored on GitHub for people to analyze. In general, GitHub's used to store lots and lots of things other than just Python code. And it's these zip files right here that you need to download and analyze. And so if you click on one of these zip files and then click the download button over here, you'll download it onto your computer. And then you'll have to use whatever zip program you have on your computer to extract that file into the same folder that you're working with for your lab. And I have extracted those files into a folder that I call data. And so then in order to open those folders, instead of saying, say monday.json, it would be data/ then the name of the file. So in this case, it could be, say, condensed_2009.json, and read from that, and that'll read the whole file. If you look at these individual files, you can see that they're a lot more cluttered than the monday.json file that we were working with. And the reason for that, again, is white space is not important in JSON. And so when people are generating these JSON files, they usually sort of compress out as much white space as they can so that it just takes up less space on your hard drive. But you can scroll through here and see that we sent quite a few tweets from 2009. For the remainder of the class today, you'll be able to get started on that lab. I'll be available to answer questions, help you get those files extracted, or help you actually implement these routines described in the lab file. Where'd it go? Here it is. The next part of the lab is essentially you'll have to count how many tweets has he sent total up until 2018, and then count some particular words. So he's mentioned himself 13,000 out of the 36,000 tweets. And then the extra credit for the lab is if you format the output nicely and convert things into percentages, then you can get 2 points of extra credit. So yeah, go ahead and spend the next part of class working on that, and I will be happy to answer any questions that people have as they come up.
Mike, can you upload the Monday
Yep,
file that we were working on?
I'll go ahead and do that right now. The monday.py file and the monday.json file should be loaded up now for you to access.
Mike, one small thing.
Mhm.
I don't think the homework week 1 is on Sakai yet. For some
Okay, I probably forgot to press the release button. Let me update that. Sorry, so the homework 1 is due this Wednesday, so that none of those have been graded yet. Is that what you were referring to, Zach?
Yeah, no, not that. It's just that it's not available to submit on Sakai. Like it just doesn't appear.
Oh, not available to submit. Let me fix that. Okay, it should be, the homework 1 should be available for you all to see the submission link now.
Yep, it's there. Thank you.
Cool, you're welcome.
Mike, can I open like the entire like folder, or do I have to open like one file at a time?
Oh, so your question is because you have like 10 different JSON files, is it possible to do those all at once? It's a great question. And the answer is that, yeah, my recommendation is don't try to open it in 10 different open functions, but instead create a single list that contains all 10 of those files inside of it, and then loop over each one of those files, calling the open function on each one of those things in the list.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
Mike, may I ask a question about the homework number 1?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So can I share your screen right now?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the